we were working on, let's say, different approaches, each team. So we were given maybe the task to think about the urban development of the site. And maybe I'm going to present at the beginning a bit our approach to the problems of the site, let's say, the task that was given to us. The first question was to think more about this site as a tool. Often we were discussing questions of identity, image, and what this could be as a very strong symbol for the city. And although this is very important, we were thinking that we have to really think about this site as a tool. It was a former factory. It needs to be adapted, but to think at what it could enable, what it could make possible in terms of services, the way, how it could empower the city. So we think of, for example, a car as a beautiful object. Architects have always been fascinated to make cars look like buildings, or buildings look like cars, but it's also a vehicle for something. So we are trying to emphasize that performance, let's say, dimension of the site, and I think that'll be clearer as we present the project. We're also thinking about the future, which was the task for all three teams, but the future is uncertain, as everybody knows, especially I think the situation in Kyiv and in Ukraine. So we have to think maybe about immediate futures. That is, what are available resources? How can we start to work on the site with what is available, with what exists, and not make grand plans which will, in a way, happen perhaps in a very far future. So we're looking at this question of what could art mean in this place. I think that was basically the task to think about this art cluster where there have been projects proposed for here, and we imagined what does it mean to have art not only perhaps thinking of this area in aesthetic terms as a beautiful decor, which it is. I think it has been an incredible place to house this event, but also to think, is that enough? There is also in a way to think of the future as an event, as an exceptional event. Perhaps that is too exclusive, and that we can be perhaps more ambitious about the program. And so what I'm going to present with the team is first our programmatic strategy to rethink this question of art. Perhaps art could be related or interconnected with other needs of the city. For example, other needs that we try to detect or try to prospect for, teaching, skate park, fishing, farms, to imagine that all these dreams, perhaps this would be a place as a tool for the city, which would give back perhaps everyday programs, everyday services, and not only a place for art. So again, just a little bit more about the approach. I was very, like others, I think, impressed about how much the political discourse is focused on resolving problems, and I think architects also deal with problem solving, but I think our process was very much more about trying to understand the potentialities of the site, the resources that exist, trying to connect the site to a larger system. And you'll see that in our strategy, how do we always connect this to a larger system to understand what the meaning of a specific, let's say, building or a site might mean in a bigger picture, in a bigger territory. And this process is not a linear process in the sense that we are only coming in, not at the beginning, I would say. We're coming in a story that has already begun, and in a way we hope that this will be an interactive or iterative process that will always be feedback, and this will help you to enable more refined, more detailed, let's say, discussion and debate on the site. So in a way we're offering, in a sense, toolkits or strategies that hopefully will redefine the challenges of this site. We kind of more or less summarize our approach to provide a responsive architecture to respond to the site, for example, the qualities and the positive qualities of the site, and an adaptive environment, which is that it could change over time. So the strategy was really based not only on the physical and spatial, or let's say formal qualities of the site, but also how it could evolve over time, and especially when we talk about immediate futures, how can we imagine the future now? So reuse, recycling, redirecting, so not really, I think redirecting is important, is that how to channel the energy in new directions without defining the end product, so keeping that open, and using our imagination to reinvent a place, not from zero, from tabula rasa, but by bringing together maybe existing resources. So our programmatic strategy is really to, we're going to focus specifically on, let's say, the center of our programmatic strategy is the question of learning or education, because we believe today and also for the future, this is a critical question, a critical issue with the perhaps expanding population, the migration of people coming to Kyiv. That's also the need for new skills to adapt to the future, that the question of education is crucial, and that this should not, again, like the art cluster, should be something which is connected to other forms of social collective space or social interaction, notably the question of work. So how to bring education closer to production. I'm going to let my team talk a little bit about our ideas. For example, of mixing higher education with low education, let's say, so to speak. Informal and formal forms of education. So we did basically a kind of analysis, which is not exhaustive, of course, but a beginning to see what exists here in Kyiv or in the region, and how we can mobilize that and connect it into a very special, let's say, experimental space for learning and work.
There are lots of kinds of formal education, and we thought that it's good to make this site as a part of an educational process in Kyiv, not only for the formal institutions as art institutions. As you can see, there are lots of an academy part and the National University of Construction and Architecture and so on. So its location is pretty good for all the connections from all the parts of our city. And also we thought about the place for working centers. There are only a few of them in Kyiv. So it's not about working, it's about formal education. It's these festival connections and a few others, creative space, TED Kyiv, the Zenka Center and so on. And we need a space to work in and to share our ideas, to get new experience from other fields of study and to collaborate in some way. And we have a statistic that is it important to continue our education or not. As you can see, only the 20% of students continue their work in their field of study in first year after graduation, and only 15% of them turn into life their previous experience. So they change their field of study and try to do something new. And it could be a place to open other directions to their development. And as you can see, I'm a student of Kyiv National University of Construction and Architecture, and we do a lot of curriculum tasks and educational processes as this workshop, and we have no place to work in. So we work in hall, and it's not pretty good because we have to leave pretty early, and we have not enough space for production. And I think that it might be a perfect place for to improve our ideas to implement them.
So we decided to present a scheme in which pupils and students as well as adults can use this place for their study, for their work, and collaborate together on the whole process of their life. Pupils at school can visit this place to obtain new knowledge, as well as students after their formal education, and to give them an opportunity to also participate in this place.
So we're also thinking that we should really mobilize the unique qualities of, there's a lot of space here, I'm not talking about moving the schools here, but creating a platform that would connect the schools. They could come here to do workshops, could also be closer, for example, to building construction companies, materials, also maybe from Europe, working on renewable energies, new resources, new building technologies. That could be one aspect, of course. And there are a lot of other fields that could be interested in this kind of large, let's say, fabrication lab to work with the students. So we're going to show you also, here are some examples also of co-working centers, which exist. We want to, so we looked at what was existing, and then perhaps by bringing them together, again, connecting into a larger let's say, network in the city. So how did we approach maybe the physical infrastructure that exists here? So I'm not going to present basically our strategy for the building typologies, but also the open space strategy. So we tried to link, let's say, this reflection on content, on program, which was focused on the idea of learning and working, on now looking at the building site. So we had a site which was not so big, but it's part of a larger industrial neighborhood, and notably, which is in between the city center and the river, as you saw. So the first thing we approach is to say it's part of a larger system. These buildings we can maybe categorize, not unlike these sort of coffee cars or kiosks, and maybe in terms of size, we can really learn something about what's happening on the site. So we looked at that already in terms of the footprint and volume. This is something that needs to be, I would say, continued and verified, but it already allows us to see in terms of quantities how much extra large buildings, very large buildings exist on the site, and how many, for example, on the other extreme, extra small buildings exist, and that perhaps at key strategic places on the site, some buildings could be demolished and others could be preserved. So the idea to open up the site to a larger territory and to understand the meaning of each building and its potential. So we categorize this looking at these different buildings and reflecting on how we can start to intervene both in terms of spatial physical interventions and how this can be linked to our programmatic strategy. So what we're offering in a way is a toolkit, and we mentioned that at the beginning. And this toolkit is concerned with buildings, but how we operate and intervene on these buildings. So we have existing buildings, and we identified three, let's say, operations: extension, how we can over time densify the site, perhaps vertically, how we can subtract, partially demolish buildings or totally replace them, and how we can also connect buildings, for example, with covered arcades, covered courtyards, to create new forms of, let's say, interaction or perhaps connection between buildings. So just very quickly, we're going to flip through these without going into much detail and focus on maybe a few scenarios of development. So this is the kind of extension on what we call the large building. We are in one of the large buildings, just to give you a sense of what our categories are. So this is not the extra large, we are in the L size. And then over time, perhaps one of the major interventions is to work on the roof. The roof not only as something which can be opened up, as you see light, maybe bring in more light into some of these spaces, but also densify over time that roof structure, so build vertically. And perhaps also that verticality could be increased over time to use and utilize the structures if they're appropriate. Last operation is connection. Two buildings that you saw perhaps if you walk around the site. A lot of buildings have these kind of interior alleys, and that perhaps these could be covered arcades, which would allow also a way to densify over time, and to perhaps link, for example, this idea of connecting learning and working without necessarily putting it in the same volume. So here's a bit of a catalog of experiments that we're not going to detail, but we developed. And again, the same idea was applied to the different size buildings. Again, I would insist that this idea
idea of intervention and partitioning was always an idea of mixing different programs. For example, if we look at this, we have this idea of creating housing, but particularly housing which would allow for artisans or artists to work and live in the same space. So these idea of kind of ateliers or co-working centers which could be next to the schools. For example, this, where you can imagine multiple programs connected through these kind of atriums where you can have also everyday programs like markets, restaurants, mixed with places of production, construction sites.
The idea of building construction company, storing material, sponsoring, giving products here, and using these materials, which could also be recycled materials, recycled appliances, old computers. These things could be also a way of centralizing these kind of this waste of the city, which then becomes new material, can be reused and reinvented. So the last part, I'm going to finish now on the question of the open space strategy. So obviously, as you see from this picture, which you've seen already, we're at a very key or strategic site because we're close to the river, and the river is cut off from the city. So how to reconnect the city and the river? So we were presented the large-scale open space strategy, let's say, of the city at the beginning on Monday. And this is an excerpt from that report that we saw, where we see our site as part of what they call the Dnieper Pearls project, about these kind of strategic sites being developed, whether they're for business districts or for residential neighborhoods. And our site lies just behind that circle, where a kind of linear park is projected in the future. So the question here, what you see is big scale, does it equal big plans? Perhaps with this ambition to look at the larger territory we are sharing, we think it's important to link our site to larger territory, physically larger territory, but also perhaps it does not mean that we need big plans in terms of quantity or dimensions, but that with very little means and very little public space or connections, we can already start to think about the question of public space and social space. So this is the city proposal, and this is what exists as far as vegetation already. So perhaps already we can start from this kind of matrix of the city, the river's edge, as a kind of open that up, because you see the current public access is very limited. The city is basically cut off from the river in this industrial neighborhood, and large parts are not publicly accessible. You see that it's even, this is emphasized by the barriers of public transportation links, for example, the highway and the connection to the metro and the railway station. So how these infrastructural links can be, let's say, turned into a potential, that is, the site can be very well connected to these links, and somehow, how could the site participate to reconnect the city to the river? So we imagined that rather than plan a future, very large-scale public park on the river, we would start from a very minimal, let's say, promenade, and then open up the banks of the river, ready where there was a maximum of vegetation. And then we would imagine a new connection where the existing road is, a new landscape connection to the river, which basically passes next to our site. So to imagine not this large linear park, but a promenade, which could connect walking, pedestrian, and bicycle paths. Over time, this could be developed as land became available on the river's edge. And that connection, as you see our site, anyways, you see our site, one of the public parks that could be structured would be the central, let's say, landscape bridge between going from, let's say, the metro station, the railway station, to the river's edge where the existing marina exists. So just some very quick pictures of the site with these ideas of occupying some of these infrastructures, what this central landscape, let's say bridge could be, which would basically turn the entrance to our site on the other side of the site. So it would create a new urban facade, linking, creating a much more visible connection to enter the site. And I'll conclude with now just two last slides to again come back to our general approach. The future is now. We need to use existing resources. We need to think about human resources as well. And sometimes what this, I think, workshop is about is also changing the way we might perceive the site. So as much this idea of seeing things that we may perhaps ignore, see it in another way, to kind of change our perception of the site, I think is very important. So sometimes these very ordinary activities, it's enough to bring them together and to reinvent them in a way that becomes somewhat magical, that we can imagine these ordinary things are very extraordinary. So I like this quote very much of science fiction writer H.G. Wells, where we imagine, for example, if I read it, if you represent our Earth as a little ball of 1 inch diameter, then the sun would be a big globe, 9 foot across, and 323 yards away. That is about 1/5 of a mile, or 4 or 5 minutes walking. I think if we change our perception, the future is not so far away. And sometimes just a short walk, we can go very far, and I think the workshop is a little bit about that. So thank you very much for your time.